Part 4: The West in Decline. The erosion of United States economic and political hegemony. US slowing economic growth measured by a decelerating GDP growth rate, fall of net investment as a share of GDP, higher levels of unutilized productive capacity, and unemployment/underemployment began in the mid-1960s and accelerated from the early to mid-1970s. The transition to the US becoming a net importer of capital exacerbated the contradictions of monopoly capital. The change in the US capital account to becoming dependent on continuous large-scale import of capital from the 1980s onward is key to a financialized wealth generation process and a crucial economic mechanism of US imperialism. The world's capital assets are preponderantly in US dollars and feed the overall position of US monopoly finance capital. By 2009, the US began to plan its pivot to Asia to curtail China's economic growth. Under the Obama period, the US began to move against the World Trade Organization. This period also marked the increased reliance on tariffs, sanctions, protectionism, and hybrid warfare. Given that it is now dependent on large-scale net capital imports, which by 2022 reached 1 trillion US dollars a year, the US has little internal economic ability to provide economic advantages to its global north or global south allies. Indeed, it needs to continue to attempt to hollow out even more surplus from them. Under neoliberalism, the relative autonomy of the US state eroded, and private capital exerted more direct control of much of the state. Today, however, faced with rising international economic threats to the US position and the failure of neoliberalism to maintain US economic dominance, the collective political interests of the ruling class are being asserted by an increasingly autonomous state as opposed to representing the interests of individual capitalist groups. To borrow from Lenin, for the capitalists also, quote, politics must take precedence over economics, unquote. Financialization or accumulation under the face of monopoly finance capital is truly a parasitic development aimed at drawing blood from a sponge and marking the structural crisis of capital. US capital has an internal contradiction. As US capital seeks to increase surplus extraction from its own working class, it risks losing support for its external military wars, which are aimed at removing international obstacles to US capitalistic economic interests. The US ruling class is therefore forced into simultaneous attacks on the global south and its own working class. This necessitated the rise of increasingly right-wing currents in US capitalism. In the 1930s, the US had sufficient reserves to confront a deep crisis of capitalism with a reformist domestic program, unlike the open attack on the working class in Germany or Japan. However, it took World War II for the US to escape the economic depression, not, as is popularly purported, the Keynesian New Deal. Today, in this new situation, the US has no alternative but to rely on combining external aggression with an increasingly repressive domestic agenda. The US utilizes inflation to attempt to increase profits, a trend exacerbated by military spending and the debt it incurs. Interests on US military debt accounts for around 70% of US federal government net interest payments. In the 1970s, the US was able to manage the consequence of its Vietnam bonanza in military spending by removing itself from the gold standard to push the costs of this debt onto other countries. This successful attack on imperialist rivals strengthened US economic and financial power compared to them. An accurate historical perspective, as well as short-term shifts, is required when analyzing a potential decline of an empire. In Europe, the transition from slavery to feudalism took several centuries, as did the transition from feudalism to capitalism. France was still fighting remnants of feudalism in the 19th century, hundreds of years after European capitalism had begun on a small scale in Italian city-states. Figure 32. United Kingdom current account balance of payments. The relative economic decline of an imperialist state can be traced by its increasing need to extract capital from abroad, with the UK and US both following a similar historical trend. The UK stopped being an exporter capital beginning the early 1930s, figure 32. A country's balance of payments is equal to the difference between its domestic capital creation, savings/surplus, and its domestic capital investment. If a country's domestic capital creation is larger than its domestic investment, it is, therefore, exporting capital and runs a balance of payments surplus. If a country's domestic capital creation is less than its domestic capital investment, it runs a balance of payments deficit and is importing capital, that is, it has a surplus in its capital account. From 1913 to the early 1980s, with rare exceptions, the US generated more surplus than it invested domestically. It had a surplus of capital that it could invest in other countries and extend its international hegemony not only through violence. Post-World War II, the particular beneficiaries of this were imperialist countries whom the US wished to en masse integrate and dominate, as seen by the Marshall Plan in Europe. Other beneficiaries, such as Republic of Korea, became military frontier states to constrain Russia and China and thus received US economic investment. By the late 1960s, the US understood that the most urgent economic, as opposed to political, threat did not come from communism. The attention began to focus on curtailing the growth of other capitalist rivals. A few capitalist economies, first Germany in the immediate post-war period and then Japan until the late 1970s, achieved investment rates far higher than the US, reaching 30% of the GDP or above. This enabled these countries to achieve higher GDP growth rates than the US. This was a historical result of the immense defeats of the German and Japanese working classes by fascism, the consequences of which continued into the post-war period. German and Japanese capitalists were able to increase the rates of exploitation, which financed high rates of capital investment. Simultaneously, their late industrialization also allowed them access to better quality technology, which further increased productivity. While the US was prepared to accept the economic consequences of this in the immediate post-war period, the continuation of this process began to impact US economic growth. To prevent effective economic competition from these countries, the United States used political and military pressure to force down their rates of investment and, therefore, growth rates. The decoupling of the US dollar from gold in 1971 and therefore the removal of restraints on the weaponization of the US control of the international monetary system played a key role in this process. Figure 33, United States current account balance of payments. The numbers in Figure 33, positive or negative, show the balance between domestic savings/capital creation and domestic investment over the span of 120 years. A positive number, for example 0.8% for 1929, means the US is saving/creating more capital than it is investing domestically, i.e., it is lending/exporting capital abroad. A negative number, for example, minus 3.9% of GNP for 2022, means US domestic investment is higher than US domestic capital creation/saving. Thus, there's an inflow of capital of 3.9% of GNP from abroad. A positive number represents an outflow of capital from the US, and a negative number indicates an inflow of capital into the US. Figure 34, United States average annual GDP growth rate. But despite this ability to slow down imperialist rivals, the US proved incapable of raising its own economic growth rate to achieve a new higher rate of investment and exploitation, partly because of the withdrawal of the US-based capitalists from long-term productive investments within the United States. Indeed, US economic growth decelerated further. The average annual economic growth of the US today is only 2.0%, less than half its growth rate in the 1960s and far behind the rate of growth of China or indeed of a series of Asian states. Figure 34 shows that the US has had a long-term overall decline in average growth rate since 1953. Confronted with this situation, the US has subsequently turned to tariffs, economic sanctions, and technology bans, leading to an increasingly protectionist environment. However, despite this economic decline, as already analyzed, the US still maintains a military lead over all other states. US imperialism, therefore, now turns to a growing reliance on force. Figure 35. United States net savings slash net capital creation. Tracing the processes underlying this and showing the inability of the US to raise its rate of growth without a complete restructuring of the US economy, which is not on the agenda, line 1 in figure 35 shows that from 1965 onwards, US net savings slash capital creation progressively fell until by 2009 it was minus 2.7% of GNI. Line 2 shows that from the 1980s on, US borrowing from abroad, the use of capital imported from other countries, began to rise sharply. By 2002, for the first time, US borrowing from abroad was higher than its domestic net capital creation, i.e., for the first time, even the immediate increase in US capital stock was being financed more by capital from other countries than from the US itself. This slightly reversed and then fluctuated until 2020, when, once again, more of the addition to the US capital stock was financed from other countries. To summarize this overall process, the US has structured the world economy to its advantage. Its corporations obtain gargantuan amounts of surplus value through the global arbitrage in the global south, and the entire imperial system forces US dollars on foreign countries, including via not only economic processes but through US military bases and other means. The aim is to create a system whereby countries have no choice but to put their US dollars into US securities, financing the US deficit and US domestic investment. This is how global monopoly finance capital, which is an advanced form of financial imperialism backed by military and political power, works. What is upsetting this system is that monopoly capital is relatively stagnant in terms of production, the real economy, which has allowed China and other countries in the global south to leap forward in production. Hudson's super-imperialism provides useful insight on what the consequences would be if the US lost its dollar hegemony. Figure 36. Net fixed capital formation. Figure 36 shows that China has outpaced the US in net fixed capital formation, whilst the US has seen a gradual decline. Whilst this section does not cover the rise of China, it should be noted here that every year since 1992, for 30 years, China has been a net exporter of capital. It is this surplus of capital that makes economically possible the financing of international initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. This becomes a critical factor in understanding that two nuclei of international processes are developing. 1. The US has increasingly become a fetter on the development of the productive forces domestically and globally. 2. China is now focused on the development of its national productive forces and on working with the developing nations as a whole. This presents a new path to modernization through the development of the world's productive forces taken as a whole through the BRI, the Global Development Initiative, and various continental scale industrialization projects. The sunsetting of bourgeois liberal democracy. Some outside of the US have long held an illusion that democracy in the US has existed for centuries and has only recently been defaced. In 1776, both wings of US capital, those led by Alexander Hamilton and those led by Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, ensured that only property owning white males like themselves had the right to vote. From 1776 onwards, property rights were sacrosanct and subordinated all other rights. Freedom of speech was effectively restricted to those who owned the means of material production. As Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote in the German Ideology, 1846, these were generally those who owned the means of mental production, that is, the media, beginning with the printing press. In some case, in some cases, this right extended to those known to have fringe or no support, or others who were no threat to the system. Those opposing capitalist class interests who had the chance of any significant support were subjected to suppression, imprisonment, and sanctioning, as well as judicial murder or assassination. Bourgeois democracy was always a vehicle for protecting property rights. Only the pressure of the US to defend itself against socialist projects internationally in the 20th century temporarily extended voting rights to black people and increased the appearance of free speech and other civil liberties. There is a great misunderstanding internationally about the US electoral parties. From their inception, neither the Democratic nor Republican parties were formed as mass membership parties. They have been primarily top-down associations of propertied elites and professional class allies, closely aligned with the status quo. Third parties have practically no influence in the US system, a political party duopoly. The Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee that run their respective parties are formally organized as not-for-profit, tax-exempt corporations. They are primarily money-based, vote-gathering machines that periodically attract voters in the context of electoral contests and thus are quite distinct from membership political parties like many European parties. Although there are registered Democrats and Republicans, this mainly affects the right to vote in their respective primaries. Party affiliations for the vast majority of the population thus does not go beyond votes cast in particular elections. Therefore, around half of US voters see themselves as politically independent, not attached to either of the major parties. Indeed, neither political party, when in office, reflects the interests of the majority of the US population. One of the most poignant written words on the hypocrisy of America's self-proclaimed greatness is found in a poem by Langston Hughes. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great strong land of love, where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme that any man be crushed by one above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There has never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Who set the free? Not me. Surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shut down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we've dreamed, and all the songs we've sung, and all the hopes we've held, and all the flags we've hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream that's almost dead today. Large sections of the capitalist class in the global north and their hangers-on indulged in a period of euphoria caused by the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991. They deluded themselves into believing in the end of history with aspirations for a perpetual unipolar world. The War on Terror campaign espoused by the US was a brilliantly constructed methodology to gain support for militarism. Between 2006 and 2009, new realities began to set in. The demise of the Soviet Union did not result in Yeltsin's promise of a denuclearized Russia, nor the permanent establishment of a Russian government entirely following US directions. The usual cries of "who failed in Russia" followed. US strategic circles began to announce the idea, both amoral and unscientific, that the US could achieve first-strike nuclear war capability. In the face of NATO's continuing eastward expansion and claims of the United States to be on the verge of nuclear primacy, Vladimir Putin delivered his Munich speech in February 2007, marking the end of any illusions about Russia being adopted into the Anglo American club. In that speech, Putin criticized the, quote, almost uncontained hyperuse of force, military force, in international relations, unquote, and suggested that the world must not be governed by one master, one sovereign. The creation of the Center for New American Security in 2007 marked a historic marriage of two groups of foreign policy elites, the mainly Republican neoconservatives and the largely democratic liberal hawks. Their joint strategy was to move to target Russia via Ukraine immediately. Led by populist neo-fascists, the Tea Party arose in 2009. It appealed to the petty bourgeoisie and a section of the upper strata, mainly but not exclusively white, of the working class who had made little to no economic progress and feared a loss of privilege. This signaled the ending of the so-called bipartisan consensus that had dominated the US system for decades. The bubble caused by financialization turned into the Third Great Depression starting in 2008, the most significant economic crisis since the 1930s. There was growing evidence that there would be no Gorbachev in China to lead the surrender of the Chinese Revolution. The pivot to Asia, which is more precisely the pivot to China, and a strategy for the US control of Eurasia was devised. China's economy continued to expand rapidly after the beginning of the Third Great Depression, while the Western economies were anemic. In 2016, China exceeded the US in terms of GDP, PPP, and there was palpable fear that by 2030, China would surpass the US in GDP at current exchange rates, CER. The US ruling class needed a response. Neo-fascism and extreme right-wing forces grew globally. Obama, the Democratic president, adopted regressive domestic measures that would have been the envy of previous Republican administrations. Trump's election weakened the shared identity of the bourgeoisie's interest and widened awareness of the limitations of the US political system. Internationally, the situation also marked a resumption of global awareness of imperialism as the greatest danger facing humanity. Faced with the evident failure of neoliberalism, which had culminated the Third Great Depression, a new movement to reverse some aspects of the hollowing out of the state that neoliberalism had produced began. To accurately understand the events following the start of the Third Great Depression, we must evaluate the preceding 60 years. In 1964, Republican Barry Goldwater, an extreme right-wing capitalist, lost the general election but succeeded in bringing the far right into the mainstream of the Republican Party and the country. The Democrats lost the 1968 election to Richard Nixon, a Republican centrist, who seized the white Southern vote and introduced a new institutional racism-based incarceration system, which both parties have followed since. The Democratic Party began a period of internal fracturing and began abandoning any leftward positioning in the name of electability and triangulation. Instead, it attempted to capitalize on the rightward momentum of the Republicans. The 1980 election of Ronald Reagan marked the actual far-right takeover of the Republican Party. The 1985 formation of the Democratic Leadership Council, DLC, a private corporation, marked the beginning of a new phase of the Democratic Party, the rise of the New Democrats. A list of some former chairmen of the DLC included Dick Gephardt, Chuck Robb, Sam Nunn, and Joe Lieberman, old military hawks who favored shifting social spending to the military. The DLC successfully defeated the left, and its crowning victory was winning the presidency by their chosen candidate Bill Clinton in 1992. Clinton's virtue from the standpoint of the DLC was that he could bring the white South back into the Democratic Party by talking left and walking right. For example, he adopted both anti-welfare and pro-incarceration policies, both racial code positions, while making pretensions of a progressive agenda. Less anti-labor than Reagan, he nonetheless represented the Democratic strategy of trying to remain the center in a political dynamic that had shifted far to the right, with the Democrats standing for a lighter, kinder version of neoliberalism. It is instructive to think of the Democratic and Republican parties as operating like private corporations with revenue derived mainly from various capitalists to serve the interests of the shareholders and the corporation's top officers. For the Democratic Party, this includes groups like the Democratic National Committee, DNC, and the Center for American Progress, CAP or CAP. The product sold is elected office holders who implement the interests of their financiers. Well-known officials include John Podesta and Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Tony Blair and Hillary Clinton, once elected, became parasites of the state, earned tens of millions, and joined the higher echelons of the capitalist class. At least 85 of the 154 people from private interest groups who met or had phone conversations scheduled with Hillary Clinton while she led the State Department under President Obama donated a combined 156 million US dollars to the Clinton Foundation. The DNC business model requires the assembly of a disparate array of electoral blocks and the necessity of manipulating numerous social strata, groups, and movements. There is now more than ever a sharp rift between the interests of the people who vote for the Democratic Party versus the vastly different interests of the Democratic Party paymasters. A more comprehensive assessment is beyond the scope of this document. However, the idea of entrepreneurial democracy, in which the concepts of competition between individual capitalists and groups and the battle to acquire votes like a market, trace back to Joseph Schumpeter. In the last 20 years, the Republican Party has been transformed ideologically. The emergence of the Tea Party in 2009 signaled both a growing neo-fascist ideology and the creation of a more engaged core and base. Although the Republican Party also has internal fractures, the weaponization of large sections of the lower middle class has engendered a radical right that destabilizes bourgeois liberal democracy. All the previous contradictions of race, class, gender, and social identity became weaponized by both the far right and the DNC Corporation for different purposes. The social rift between various strata of the US is acute. Hyperbolic claims that the US is heading towards a civil war are highly misleading, however. There is no economic basis for California seceding from the US. This is not the pre-Civil War period in the US. Starting in 1970, the US working class received very little of the vast increases in wealth created by the US's world domination. Millions of children suffer food insecurity, and their parents have precarious employment and lives. The US is undergoing significant demographic changes, with some estimates showing that non-Hispanic whites will become a minority within the US by 2045, which suggests a trajectory of US racial capitalism toward enhanced segregation and even apartheid. Narcissism, pessimism, nihilism, and fatalism are now fundamental features of an increasingly stagnant capitalism in the global north. The traditional trappings of bourgeois liberal democracy are becoming fetters on the needs of capital, which is ironically caught up in the process of self-negation. These fissures inside the US political system are significant to the US working class, which is in a very uneven development of its revolutionary capacity. It faces great danger and opportunities. There can be no illusion that worse is better. Simultaneously with this erosion of liberal democracy, millions of young people from Jakarta to Istanbul to Johannesburg to Des Moines, Iowa have now been brought into political life based on their moral, racial, religious, and political outrage. This has been met with severe repression by Washington in its global geopolitical, economic, and hegemonic military roles. The United States is a waning hegemonic power. It is a wounded one, and as a result, is more dangerous. A defeated and submissive Europe and Japan. Since the end of World War II, the United States has been committed to the military, political, and economic integration of countries in Europe and Japan into a bloc that it controls. Through the NATO Plus structure, the US ensured complete military dominance within the imperialist group, deploying many military bases in countries defeated in World War II, including in Japan 120, Germany 119, and Italy 45. The latter is home to over 12,000 US military personnel. Beginning in the 1950s, the US brought European political elites into their orbit. Through the Marshall Plan, European economic interests were subordinated to those of the US. Over the next 50 years, even imperialist leaders who dared to partially oppose US interests, such as Jacques Chirac, President of France between 1995 and 2007, or Gerhard Schröder, Chancellor of Germany from 1998 to 2005, both of whom opposed the US invasion of Iraq, were targeted by the US for replacement. After World War II, Japan, as a frontline state against Soviet and Chinese communism, was allowed to rapidly develop its economy. However, in the 1980s, Japan's economic rise began to pose a possible threat to the United States' global economic hegemony, leading to increased bilateral trade frictions. The United States forced a rapid appreciation of the Japanese yen through the 1985 Plaza Accord, reducing exports and causing Japan to lose its economic momentum. Then, following the 1987 Wall Street crash, the US compelled Japan to adopt ultra loose monetary and economic policies. This aimed to increase the flow of capital to the US to aid finance its international aggression against the USSR. In the process, it created the bubble economy in Japan, the bursting of which plunged Japan into a decades long economic stagnation. In the fields of information technology and new energy, among other high tech areas, Japan also faced suppression from the United States, hindering its industrial upgrading. Toshiba was the global leader in semiconductor manufacturing by 1987 until it was sanctioned by the US under the pretext of making deals with the USSR, very similar to what the United States has done with Huawei in China. Toshiba's main competitors, IBM and Intel, benefited from this policy by the US state. After the fall of the Soviet Union and Germany's subsequent reunification, the German bourgeoisie coveted Russia's markets and low cost energy. They desired economic ties with Russia, but only as long as they and their French compatriots could maintain their unfettered domination of the European project, which they had held since World War II. This meant building economic ties with Russia, but excluding Russia's political leadership from any equal participation in Europe's political affairs, decisions, or structures. U.S. strategy, in turn, had been to avoid any strategic relationship between Russia and Germany as their combined strength would create a formidable economic competitor in Europe. Ownership of capital and the means of production are always fundamental. Over the last 30 years, the ability of capital to move quickly and seamlessly between the borders of imperialist countries has increased exponentially. Capital investments have a defined number of primary categories, including stock, notes, bonds, private equity, real estate, and many forms of derivatives. The stock market is one of the fundamental vehicles for most capitalists to make long term investments. A German firm that goes public may do so in either the US or German stock exchanges. Large funds like Vanguard purchase these funds, but they are not the beneficial owners. They are just effective trustees for the funds of major capital. Some small percentage of this capital is owned by the petty bourgeoisie and privileged sectors of the working class through pension funds and other instruments. The original shareholders of this firm eventually can and do sell their now public stock. They can they no longer remain dependent on managing their wealth with their investment inside one company. Rather, they hire wealth managers, either through firms such as Goldman Sachs or their own advisors, who in turn invest the cash proceeds from the sale of stock. For many capitalists, their advisors will have them invest well over 50% of their portfolio in the US stock market. The German capitalist family wealth therefore does not disappear when the German company they had originally owned declines in value. The economic, political, and social consequences of this change in capital markets and ownership are vast. This newly minted global, formerly German capitalist behaves very much like their French, English, Swedish, or US peers. This level of integration and denationalization of capital result in a much more robust economic and eventually reinforces political allegiance to the US. Such a high level of stock market and capital integration rarely occurs in global south countries for many historical reasons. A capitalist in Turkey has much greater difficulty having their company go public in the US. What the Turkish capitalist can do is to go public in Turkey, sell their stock, turn the proceeds into US dollars, and then invest those dollars in US stocks. This is the most common pathway for the Turkish capitalist to join the global elite. This process, however, is much more competitive, happens in smaller amounts, is less frequent, and is elongated. Figure 37, non-domestic investment in selected country markets. Figure 37 shows research from the OECD that indicates the percentage of beneficial foreign ownership for each of the major stock markets in the world. These show that Europe overall has a high percentage of foreign ownership, whereas the US, China, and Saudi Arabia all have less than 20% foreign ownership. Different national imperialisms and their ruling classes are not separate or economically divided from each other. They do not pursue substantially divergent strategic national goals on any scale comparable to that before World War II. Progressive and socialist forces, however, always utilize partial economic or tactical differences between imperialist powers where valuable. Figure 38. Germany, a vassal imperialist state. The situation in Germany today, for example, clearly illustrates the effectiveness of this integration process and economic consolidation by the US, as shown in Figure 38. According to 2020 IHS market data, only 13.3% of the German stock market's value is owned by Germans, while investors from North America and the UK own 58.3%. A 2023 study by Ernst & Young revealed that at least 52.1% of the market value of the 40 blue chip stocks that make up Germany's DAX index is owned by funds outside of Germany in 2022. Of the remaining shares, 16.5% ownership is unidentified, very likely also owned by foreign capital, with only 31.3% of the market value owned by Germans. The major companies of the German economy are primarily not owned by Germans. Germany's industrial value added has declined from 9% of the world to just above 6% in the last 18 years. The loss of cheap Russian energy and its adoption to risk-managed decoupling are likely to be disastrous for its international competitiveness. In addition, the advent of electric vehicles, EV, has led to a huge loss with the end of the importance of the combustion engine. This had been a core 100-year technology superiority enjoyed by Germany. In 2022, FDI in Germany decreased 50.4% year on year. Over the course of 15 quarters, starting in Q3 2019, Germany's GDP increased by a paltry 0.6% in total in constant prices, whereas China increased 20.2% during the same period and the US by 8.1%. In media, the US dominates more than the global south. The European television market is largely a US business. Quote, around 1 in 5, 18%, of all private TV channels, excluding local TV, are US owned, and over one-third of all SVOD, 39%, and TVOD, 33% services in Europe belong to a US company. Around half of all children's TV channels in Europe are US owned, 48%, and so are 59% of entertainment subscription video on demand services. Unquote. The collapse of national will, the willingness to pursue a path corresponding to its national capitalist interests, demonstrated by Germany in the context of the war in Ukraine, shows that Germany has been defeated for a third time since the beginning of the 20th century, the first two being the World Wars, as noted by Hudson. Despite the cost to itself, Germany supported sanctions against Russia and military aid to Ukraine. When Israel's war on Gaza entered its 100th day, having killed more than 23,000 Palestinians, Germany, with its historical violence in Namibia and domestic holocaust against Jewish people during World War II, supported Israel in the hearing at the International Court of Justice brought by South Africa. Over the last few months of 2023, political representatives of German capital in the Bundestag privately raised and then introduced measures to restrict trade with China under the guise of de-risking. This is clearly in contradiction to the short and medium term interests of German business. Marx described the relations between the capitalists as one between a band of warring brothers. In periods of crisis, the state, as an organ of the ruling class, exerts its political role despite the vociferous nature of intra-capitalist relations. Today, the short-term interests of executives as at nominally German companies are subordinated to the interests of hyper-imperialism. With the formation of the German Empire, 1871 to 1918, political and economic expansion into Eastern Europe rather than solely territorial expansion was a key strategy. After reunification in 1990, Germany pursued a dual strategy. First, it decisively supported the US strategy towards Russia of NATO expansion. Second, it led a simultaneous strategy of capital penetration into Russia with the aim of securing political control in that state of groups most tied to Western and German interests, and again those pursuing a more independent policy. German capital supported proxies like Russian billionaire at the time, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. In 2001, Khodorkovsky established the Open Russia Foundation with Henry Kissinger as one of its trustees. By 2004, he was imprisoned for fraud and embezzlement after attempting to carry out policies against Putin. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel pursued dual strategies of supporting military preparations against Russia and organizing the internal opposition to Putin. She also orchestrated the building of Nord Stream 2 despite huge US resistance. The latter, however, was for German self-interest, not for the appeasement of Russia, nor to hinder NATO expansion. In 2014, she arranged the release of Khodorkovsky and enabled a calculated breach of the Minsk agreements. But the dual strategy ended in February 2022, when Germany was a willing partner alongside the US and with the help of Ukraine decided to wrestle and topple Russia. Germany's reality, however, is that unless it were prepared to undertake a full break with US policy, with no significant section of the German bourgeoisie is prepared to consider, any strategy it has fails without US support, giving the US the whip hand in this relationship. A paradox arose in which the US wanted to maintain German-Russia enmity, but not support a full German victory against Russia. This explains in part why the US appears to be threatening to cut off Ukraine's funding. The US goal of destroying German-Russian relations has already been achieved, as well as the vassalage of Europe and Germany under the penalty of the deindustrialization of Germany. The US will continue to deprive the German bourgeoisie of all major options for asserting independent political positions. With the help of the capital ownership links that we have described, the German bourgeoisie will be faced with absolute subsumption of the options for the action of German capital under the US aegis. The hostility towards Russia acts as a driver of Europe's subordination to the US and a loss of any possibility of independent development. The situation of antagonistic contradictions between US and European capital on fundamental issues has ceased. Small differences exist, but they are not strategic. The depth of US subordination of Europe is seen by the fact that only 11 of the 49 countries in the global north are not part of a known US spy network, nor attended the Vilnius NATO Plus meeting. They are Andorra, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cyprus, Ireland, Liechtenstein, Malta, Moldova, Monaco, San Marino, Serbia, and Switzerland. Collectively, they have 28.3 million people, nearly equivalent to Delhi's population, and a combined GDP of 1.8 trillion US dollars, 1% of world GDP, a small portion of the global north. While a member of the secret 14 Eyes, Germany's impotence was on full display when it was revealed that the US spied on its leaders and it was incapable of even a whimper. Today, Europe's bourgeoisie has become a toady for US intelligence operations. NATO has long pressured Germany to spend a minimum of 2% of GDP on the military, following what was called Goldilocks principle established in the 1950s, aimed at, quote, encouraging defense contributions from medium-sized allies, for example, the Republic of Korea during the Cold War or Poland today, while treading lightly when it comes to larger allies like Germany or Japan. In doing so, it seeks to maximize contributions from allies that are powerful enough to supply meaningful military power to the alliance, but not so powerful that they can afford to spurn the alliance. Unquote. Japan's governments have pursued policies of political provocation to China at the behest of the US, despite the great advantages to Japan's economy that would flow from closer ties with China. In the UK, US opposition to the golden period of relations with China, carried out under David Cameron's premiership, forced its reversal under his successors, with damaging consequences for British capital. In 2022, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida set spending targets for the following 5 years of 43 trillion yen, that's 316 billion US dollars. It already has the second greatest number of F-35 advanced aircraft in the world after the US and signed an agreement in 2020 to purchase 105 additional aircraft. These aircraft can be retrofitted with nuclear weapons. It has penned a revised national security strategy to allow the country to develop a preemptive strike capability and deploy long-range missiles. The rearming of the two main fascist powers of World War II must be considered a crime. A dangerous revanchist movement is re-emerging in Germany. The difference is that this time they do so as part of the US-led military bloc. Part 5. Changes in the World Order. A southward shift of the economic base. Figure 39. Global South versus Global North. Share of the world GDP PPP. As the countries of the Global North have faced prolonged declining economic growth, countries of the Global South, especially in Asia, have displayed a higher economic growth trajectory over the past 30 years. As can be seen in Figure 39, at the end of the Cold War in 1993, the Global North accounted for 57.2% of the global GDP, PPP, while the Global South accounted for just 42.8%. 30 years later, these proportions have definitively inverted. The share of the Global South has reached 59.4%, with the Global North holding at 40.6%. Figure 40. BRICS versus G7. Share of the world GDP, PPP. The G7, United States, United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, is the core economic countries of the Global North Bloc, and in 1993, these seven countries accounted for 45.4% of the global economy. Meanwhile, the most significant economies of the Global South, later known as BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, made up only 16.7% of the global economy in that year. Among them, Russia had just emerged after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and China was deepening its economic reforms and establishing a socialist market economy. Neither Russia nor China were competitors to the G7 at the time. 30 years later, the BRICS countries accounted for 31.5% of the global economy, having surpassed the G7 30.3%, as shown in Figure 40. Figure 41, BRICS 10 versus G7, share of the world GDP, PPP. In August 2023, BRICS expanded by inviting six countries: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Argentina, although Argentina has now temporarily declined. BRICS 10, excluding Argentina, added 4% to BRICS' share of the world GDP, PPP, as shown in Figure 41. Figure 42. China versus the United States, share of the world GDP, PPP. Over the past 30 years, the absolute leader of the global north, the United States, has seen its share of the world economy slowly decline in PPP terms from 19.7% in 1993 to 15.5% in 2022. However, in the global south, China's rapid rise has been the most notable variable. In 1993, China only accounted for 5% of the world economy, figure 42. By 2016, China's economy had surpassed that of the United States in PPP terms, and by 2022, China's share of the world economy had reached 18.4%. This marks the first time in over 600 years that a non-white dominated country has economically broken through the hegemony of the white imperialist countries. This economic reality led the US to urgently begin to try to suppress China's rise. Figure 43, Global South, excluding China, versus the Global North. Share of the world GDP, PPP. However, it would be a mistake to view China as the sole source of growth for the Global South. Even without China, the economies of the Global South had surpassed the Global North by 2022, with their respective shares of the global economy at 41% and 40.6%, figure 43. The overall economic development of the Global South has enabled them to objectively have the capacity and to seek a more just international order, which is contrary to the wishes of the imperialist bloc of the Global North. Figure 44, Global South 43 versus United States, share of world GDP, PPP. We have identified all 43 countries whose share of the world GDP, PPP, amounts to 41.1%, figure 44, that are part of one or more of the three new non-imperialist controlled international organizations. BRICS 10, founded in 2009, expanded in 2010 and 2023. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, founded as Shanghai 5 in 1996, expanded in 2001, 2017, and 2023. And the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations, founded in 2021. The full list is provided in a later section. Figure 45, Global South 21 versus G7, average annual growth rate. Figure 45 shows the past decade's average annual growth rate of GDP, PPP, per capita of the 21 largest economies in the Global South and the G7 countries. China's growth rate, 5.8%, continues to lead among major countries. Asia's growth rate is generally higher than other countries in the Global South. The next 5 countries with the highest growth rates are Bangladesh, 5.3%, Vietnam, 4.9%, India, 4.6%, the Philippines, 3.3%, and Indonesia, 3.1%. Aside from the US, the rest of the G7 countries have an average per capita growth rate of less than 1%. Regrettably, the largest economies in Africa and Latin America have experienced negative per capita growth. Nigeria and South Africa at minus 0.4%, and Brazil and Argentina at 0% and minus 0.7%, respectively. Of course, we acknowledge that growth rates themselves can mask the intense class struggles within these countries, where the share of the growth is not nearly equitably distributed between capital and labor. However, it would be a mistake to ignore the growth rates and what their trend lines describe. One of the most significant changes in the world economy of the last 20 years has been a dramatic shift in the geography of world industrial production. The World Bank publishes the industry percentage of GDP using the current prices and current exchange rates, which this study refers to as the current exchange rate (CER) method. Currently, we are unaware of any published industry percentages for GDP PPP calculations. Figure 46, Global South versus Global North, share of world industry value added. Figure 47, Global South versus Global North, share of world industry value added. Figures 46 and 47 show changes in the percentage of industry value added in GDP for both CER and PPP terms over the last 18 years. It is likely that the figures of the industry value added world share are somewhere in between the CER and PPP. Subsequent charts in the series are shown only for the PPP method and have the same qualifications as made for the first series. What we see is that there is indeed a change in the base of the economy, with the global south home to the majority share. Despite many predictions of a new post industrial society, no major country has achieved modernization without industrialization. Figure 48, a BRICS 10 versus G7, share of world industry value added. The world share of industry value added BRICS 10 is now double that of the G7, figure 48. Figure 49. Selected countries. Share of world industry value added France, Germany, India, Japan, Russia, and UK. The results show the following for industry value added as a percentage of the world using GDP PPP. China is the world's leading industrial country with a 25.7% share value added, while the US holds only a 9.7 share. The Global South has a 69.4% share, while the Global North has a 30.6% share. BRICS 10 has a 44% share and exceeds the G7. The share of Japan, Germany, France, and the UK are also declining, whilst India is increasing. Figure 49. We used the World Bank industry percentage multiplied by the annual GDP PPP for each country for each year to derive a country-based industrial value added. We then used these to calculate the percentage of total world industry value added by each country and country grouping category. There are some limitations and complex issues regarding this methodology. Some economists have tried to minimize this change. Some argue that US dollar monopolies and ownership of large multinational corporations mean GDP figures overstate the change. China, at a minimum, cannot be said to have all its production under the lock and key of the US. Even in India, it is a mistake to understate the significance of a growing big national bourgeoisie, albeit large sections of it politically reactionary. Moving industrial production to the global south could only have occurred with massive improvements in their infrastructure. In his parting words to Russian President Vladimir Putin during his state visit in March 2023, Chinese President Xi Jinping said, "Right now there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes together." Unquote. Eurasia is now center stage for determining the future of the next period of human existence. U.S. strategy to curtail China's economic growth and influence. In 2007, Vladimir Putin delivered his famous Munich speech criticizing U.S. monopolistic dominance, quote, almost uncontained hyper-use of force, military force, in international relations, force that is plunging the world into an abyss of permanent conflicts, unquote. In the same year, the Center for the New American Security, CNAS, was formed. By 2009, secret U.S. cables to Washington revealed by WikiLeaks stated, Xi knows how very corrupt China is and is repulsed by the all-encompassing commercialization of Chinese society with its attendant nouveau riche, official corruption, loss of value, dignity, and self-respect, and such moral evils as drugs and prostitution. When Xi takes the helm of the party, he might aggressively attempt to address those evils, perhaps at the expense of the new moneyed class, unquote. The alarm bells in Langley and Foggy Bottom were ringing. The West Dream for the rise of a Chinese Gorbachev was eviscerated in 2012. It became clear that an economically ascendant China would not be imminently defeated. Thus, the pivot to Asia strategy began integrating its allies to contain China. Then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton publicly declared that the 21st century will be America's Pacific century. In contrast, Xi Jinping said to U.S. President Barack Obama, the Pacific Ocean is broad enough to accommodate the development of both China and the United States. By 2016, China's GDP, calculated by purchasing power parity, had surpassed that of the United States. In 2020, the Center for Economics and Business Research predicted that by 2028, China's GDP, measured in US dollars, would overtake that of the US, a forecast that became a demon barrier. U.S. officials repeatedly defined China as the most significant strategic threat facing the U.S. and the global North. The relative decline of U.S. power, the rise of socialist China, and the economic growth of the global South are key reasons behind U.S. active subordination and subsequent integration of the rest of the imperialist countries. This has led to a full military, political, and economic bloc under U.S. control. In 1998, former U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski warned the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran, not out of a sudden love for one another, but out of a shared opposition to the predominant power, the United States. CNAS, formed by a combination of neocons and liberal hawks, spawned a core cadre of U.S. policy elites from both parties who focus on developing a new geopolitical strategy for the U.S. By 2021, ignoring Brzezinski's warning, they began publicly promoting the preparation for simultaneous wars. Significant figures from the CNAS include Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, and former Under Secretary of Defense for Policy Michel Flournoy. Former CNAS staff and consultants have permeated strategic organs of the state, including the National Security Council. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, whilst not a member of CNAS, now plays a dominant role in the presidency and pursues the same international strategy. In April 2023, Sullivan gave a speech titled Renewing American Economic Leadership at the Brookings Institute. This speech was significant for three distinct reasons. First, it is very unusual for such an important speech on the U.S. economy to be given by a national security advisor. Historically, national security advisors like Henry Kissinger stayed in the realms of national security, geopolitics, and military affairs. Second, Sullivan's speech sought to create a new Washington consensus to re-establish U.S. economic hegemony. Third, Sullivan acknowledged the depth of the U.S. structural crisis, including its economic stagnation. This economic plan is required to support military expansion. In July 2023, the US proposed a bill to add 345 million US dollars in military aid to Taiwan. From Tel Aviv to Kiev to Taipei, the US is escalating its military operations to the doorsteps of Eurasia. Cold wars, necessarily associated with conflicts between nuclear powers, are always dangerous. In 1988, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky published Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media, in which they decried the propaganda model utilized by the US corporate media, often in partnership with the state. They wrote it long before the system was able to avail itself of the new technological tools of surveillance and targeted communication characterizing the digital age. Thanks to whistleblower Edward Snowden, the world was able to get a glimpse of the vast expansion of US control over all communications and how it has integrated all the US IT tech monopoly platforms into adjuncts of US national security infrastructure. Collect it all was how a former senior intelligence officer described the National Security Agency's former director Keith Alexander's approach to data collection. All the emails, phone calls, and text messages of all types, including those of WhatsApp, Telegram, and Signal, every keystroke and every URL are captured for the vast majority of the world's population outside of China, Russia, and a few other countries. They are stored in vast networks of hard drives in locations like Bluffdale, Utah. The US created a global network able to capture and manage nearly every packet of data on all undersea optical cables, all cellular traffic, and satellite data traffic. Despite military hegemony, capital still needs the approximation of consent. Over time, new techniques such as machine learning created a qualitative leap in the ability of the US to conduct psychological secret warfare against the people, the global south, and their populations. The economic models of all media companies collapsed with the advent of the internet and the creation of economic tech monopolies, which disintermediated all media profits. A new era of fully weaponized media outlets began, a development that is part of the overall hybrid war strategy, including economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation, that has been utilized by the US establishment around the world. The pivot to Asia, in reality a pivot to China, began formally in 2012 under Obama. The US combined propaganda, diplomatic, economic, and political strategies to try to curb at first China's economic development and later its growing influence in institutions like BRICS. Starting in 2016, Trump attempted to avoid conflict with Russia and began to focus all US energies against China. Over the last 8 years, the US used a coterie of selected and curated topics to define the Western media narrative on China. Despite millions of dead Muslims at the hands of NATO forces in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the West managed to integrate their formidable array of soft power resources to wage a fierce Cold War against China. Even the chief propagandist of the Nazis, Joseph Goebbels, might have been amazed at the hubris of the West in claiming the mantle of human rights and attempting to use Xinjiang as the whipping point against China. Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell and former Army Colonel, noted that an important strategic goal of the U.S. military's invasion and long-term stationing in Afghanistan was to contain China's Belt and Road Initiative, 2013 to the present, and to create ethnic divisions and social unrest in Xinjiang. The New York Times, the Guardian, and the BBC became central props in a hallmark U.S. PSYOPs campaign. As we have explained in the economic analysis of Western economies, it is not irrational for the West to seek to retard China's growth. Central to the next stage of development of China's economy is promoting a dual circulation economy, i.e., to increase the weight of the domestic market while continuing to keep growing its international trade, switching to high quality development, and advancing the economic development of the western provinces of China. Attacking Xinjiang simultaneously accomplishes many Western interests, weakens China's domestic growth strategies, isolates China internationally, masks U.S. violence against Muslim countries, and continues to support extremist groups to destabilize their adversaries. Fabricated allegations of genocide among the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, entirely unsubstantiated by the U.S. State Department, enabled the US government to impose sanctions on China, aiming to strike at China's entire textile industry chain, which exports more than 300 billion US dollars and accounts for over one-third of the world's textile exports, ranking first globally. But despite US sanctions, Xinjiang's foreign trade surged by 51.25% year on year, reaching 30 billion US dollars in the first 3 quarters of 2023, with trade with five Central Asian nations increasingly by 59.1%. China has just announced a free trade zone in Xinjiang to promote connectivity with regional Belt and Road countries. In addition to soft power warfare, the US spared no effort to contain China's development in high tech sectors, especially in weakening China's capacity to produce or even purchase top end semiconductor chips. By imposing long arm jurisdiction on technologies such as extreme ultraviolet EUV lithography machines manufactured by the Dutch company ASML, the US seeks to prevent China from entering the future of chip technology. The Biden administration believes that its impact will extend far beyond weakening China's military advancements, but also threatening China's economic growth and scientific leadership. Gregory C. Allen, director of the Artificial Intelligence Governance Project and senior fellow in the Emerging Technology Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, believes that the message conveyed by the export controls against China issued by the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, in October 2022 is part of, quote, a new U.S. policy of actively strangling large segments of the Chinese technology industry, strangling with an intent to kill, unquote. CJ Muse, an industry analyst in the US, stated, if you told me about these rules 5 years ago, I would have told you that's an act of war. We'd have to be at war, unquote. Figure 50. China, United States, and Eurozone accumulated GDP growth. Despite severe restrictions by the US, China continues to outgrow the global north. Figure 50. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China strengthens its economic connections with the global south. From 2013 to 2022, China's total trade volume with countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative reached 19.1 trillion US dollars, with an average annual increase of 6.4%. Cumulative bilateral investment exceeded 380 billion US dollars, and China's foreign direct investment exceeded 240 billion US dollars. China's new contracted project reached 2 trillion US dollars with a cumulative turnover of 1.3 trillion US dollars completed. Ironically, US containment in high-tech fields has only strengthened China's resolve for self-reliance in innovation. In recent years, China has made significant breakthroughs in independent innovation in high end chips, electric vehicles, and digital technology, making the US blockade and containment in high tech fields increasingly unrealistic. The global north pushing the world towards war. The peaceful rise of the global south countries, led by Asia and especially China, poses a comprehensive economic challenge to imperialist world dominance. For the first time in 600 years, the Atlantic imperialist powers are confronted with a non white economic force capable of countering them. To contain China's rise, the US is intensifying internal integration within the imperialist camp, allowing and demanding that two fascist countries defeated in World War II, Japan and Germany, rearm themselves. US political leaders unanimously consider it essential to contain and defeat China as a core strategic enemy and started a new Cold War. US military leaders make alarming statements about China. The US geopolitical goal is to overthrow the regimes of China and Russia, denuclearize, and if possible, dismember both countries, split them into several small countries, and ensure they can never again challenge US military or economic hegemony. On Russia's western border, NATO's eastward expansion has brought the security issue of Ukraine to a critical boiling point. Before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the United States had promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastward since its original mission, countering the Soviet Union and containing European communism, had concluded with the end of the Cold War. However, NATO reneged on that gentleman's agreement and it inducted 14 new member states, including several former Soviet republics. In 2018, Ukraine amended its construction to prioritize joining NATO and the European Union as its national strategy, posing a significant threat to Russia's national security. With Kiev only 760 kilometers away from Moscow, allowing NATO to deploy nuclear weapons in Ukraine would constitute an uncontrollable military threat to Russia. Simultaneously, neo-Nazi forces in western Ukraine were on the rise. In January 2022, torchlight processions were held in cities like Kiev and Lviv, commemorating the birthday Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera. Prior conflicts saw Western Ukrainian nationalist extremists hoisting Nazi flags and threatening to annihilate Eastern Ukrainians and pro-Russian elements. Ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine had to organize resistance and seek Russian aid. Under these circumstances, Russia launched a special military operation in Ukraine, essentially facing a direct confrontation with NATO's military force. In the Western Pacific, the United States continuously attempts to stoke tensions over the South China Sea and Taiwan. In August 2022, despite strong opposition and solemn representations from China, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, seriously violating the One China principle and the provisions of the three U.S. China joint communiques, severely impacting the political foundation of Sino-American relations. It is important to recall that in 1972, in the Shanghai Communique, the United States accepted the One China policy, which acknowledges that there is only one China and that Taiwan is not a separate sovereign state. In August 2023, the U.S. Navy, along with forces from Canada and the Republic of Korea, conducted joint military exercises in the Sea of Japan and the Yellow Sea. However, the exercises ended abruptly after just 5 hours due to China's targeted military mobilizations. Since Ferdinand Marcos Jr. became president of the Philippines in June 2022, the Philippines has opened multiple military bases on the U.S., strengthened security ties with Australia and Japan, and sparked disputes with China over sovereignty issues in the South China Sea. Warships from the US, Canada, Australia, and other countries also frequently patrol and exercise in the South China Sea, causing several close encounters and frictions with the Chinese Navy. To date, faced with continuous provocations from the United States and its allies, China has maintained a restrained stance, striving to avoid military conflicts with the US and its allies, a confrontation that could escalate into a global nuclear war. However, Taiwan holds a special significance for China. As part of China, historically and under international law, Taiwan's continued separation signifies that China's civil war and even the century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars in 1840 has not ended. The division of Taiwan is unacceptable to China, ultimately, even if it means the risk of direct war against the United States. With the direct support of Biden and Blinken, Israel is advancing an ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. The situation in Gaza starkly reveals the true face of the imperialist camp of the global north as a collective of white settlers. When conflicts arise between white settlers and colonized people of color, the imperialist camp uniformly stands with the settlers. The fault lines of Ukraine and Palestine have exacerbated the polarization of the Social Democrats, sections of whom have proven unable to overcome their desire for acceptability and join in a robust movement for peace. Let us return to the quote from NATO and the EU that they would be protecting our 1 billion citizens, preserving our freedom and democracy against all threats. This sentence, appearing in the first paragraph of the NATO EU 2023 communique, clearly outlines the structure of today's world. The imperialist camp, centered around the US and based on NATO infrastructure, is fully united and mobilized militarily, politically, and economically, ready to stifle any emerging forces that might pose a threat to their hegemonic status. This unprecedented, immense imperialist pressure has forced many in the rest of the world, those outside the imperialist camp, to identify alternative structures and identities for self preservation. Epilogue: A credible economic and political alternative world order. Figure 51, GS 43, 43 member states of Global South emergent multilateral organizations. 25 years after the publication of Zbigniew Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard 1997, identifying this as the greatest geopolitical danger from the US, China, Russia, and Iran have indeed grown closer in various fields, including economics, politics, and security. Not coincidentally, they are the only three countries that are in the BRICS 10, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations, Figure 51. The driving force behind this convergence, precisely as Brzezinski predicted, is the escalating hegemonic pressure from the imperialist group led by the United States. Compared to NATO, which is highly unified in ideology, military command, and intelligence sharing, there is no anti imperialist international organization that is comparable. Nevertheless, three influential international organizations have emerged within the Global South. The BRICS organization, initiated by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is an economic cooperation mechanism that expands to 17 official and unofficial cooperating partners after the BRICS summit in August 2023. BRICS 10 represents 45.5% of the world population, 35.6% of the GDP, PPP, and 44% of the global industrial output. The BRICS New Development Bank began with 100 billion US dollars in capital investment, and its contingent reserve structure also holds 100 billion US dollars. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, started with a focus on security issues. It brings together countries from the Eurasian continent, from the large economic performers like China, India, and Turkey, to the leading OPEC countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as well as member countries of the League of Arab States, to address security challenges through multifaceted development approaches. The SCO represents 60% of the Eurasian territory, a quarter of the world's GDP, and 40% of the global population. In July 2023, Xi Jinping proposed the creation of an SCO development bank. The newly established Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations, FUNC, seeks to advocate for multilateralism and oppose hegemony and unilateralism within the framework of the UN Charter. Currently, this group has 20 member countries, with Venezuela as its initiator. On the issue of Palestine, the group supports the just demand for national independence of the Palestinian people, backs Palestine's bid to become a formal member of the United Nations, and supports the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Hitting its 10-year milestone, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has also had significant impact on the Global South. To date, with an investment surpassing 1 trillion US dollars, the BRI has been a pivotal force in infrastructure development in the Global South. Figure 52, Shared Interests of the Global South. Contrary to the imperialist camp, the primary aspirations of the global South countries are sovereignty and development, and to achieve peace. Specifically, they face at least 8 common challenges and opportunities, figure 52, elaborated on below. Multilateralism. Engaging in profound multilateral dialogues and cooperation among global South countries without reliance on platforms provided by the global North countries. New modernization. Building regional economic integration through economic corridors and belts within the global South to realize economies of scale at the continental level. De-dollarization, reducing dependence on the US dollar, especially for those countries facing sanctions, in international trade through mechanisms like local currency transactions, currency swaps, and regional common currencies. Innovation led by the Global South, promoting democratic and open technological innovation among Global South countries. This includes reducing the economic premium caused by intellectual property monopolies in areas like medicine, new energy, and information technology. Reparations and debt resolution, addressing the century old debt trap imposed by imperialist countries through collective negotiations for reductions and compensations. Food sovereignty, ensuring the people's and states' right to define their agricultural and food policy without any dumping vis a vis third countries, transnational corporations, and free trade agreements. Digital sovereignty, enhancing the capability of global South countries to control digital spaces in hardware, software, data, content, standards, and regulations, and constructing alternatives to the US monopolized digital platforms. Environmental justice, formulating fair emission rights, allocation plans, and urging imperialist countries to compensate for their long term cumulative pollution. Financialization of nature is a dead end for the global South. Humanity faces a dangerous and ruthless military power. The US is on a march to rearm the two main fascist powers of World War II as it itself turns more towards a politics of the extreme right and neo fascism. It is sadly very true that the left forces outside the socialist camp are indeed weak, and that the subjective aspect of revolution in most countries is not ready for conducting revolution. But we are witnessing significant changes and breaks in consciousness, albeit not full class consciousness. Millions of people are in the streets, reviled by the sickness of not only the US and Israel's genocidal regimes, but also of France and the UK. The four nuclear powers of imperialism have banded together, demonstrating their power. The likely cost of this will be the creation of a future generation of youth in the Arab and Muslim world who will never forget nor forgive this flaunting of brutality and humiliation. Mao Zedong described this historical dialectic. Imperialism and all reactionaries, looked at in essence from a long term point of view, from a strategic point of view, must be seen for what they are paper tigers. On this, we should build our strategic thinking. On the other hand, they are also living tigers, iron tigers, real tigers that can devour people. On this, we should build our tactical thinking. Unquote. Under President Xi Jinping's leadership, China has proposed visionary recommendations for humanity. The China model of modernization, a result of socialism with Chinese characteristics, indicates a path for the global South countries that does not rely on exploiting and oppressing other nations. It balances the material and spiritual civilization, economic development, and the ecological environment, offering an essential reference for the development of the global South. As a result of over 600 years of humiliation, racial violence, and economic exploitation by the global North, we have arrived at this stage of hyper-imperialism. However, an emerging global South, even with its contradictions, reminds us that human beings are not constrained to remain victims of history. Despite the different contexts of subjective factors, the concluding call of the Communist Manifesto 1848 remains compelling today. We have a world to win. Black Woman by Cuban poet Nancy Morejon. Still I smell the foam of the sea they forced me to cross. Night I cannot recall the night, nor could the ocean itself recall it. But never have I forgotten the first seagull I glimpsed. high up the clouds like innocent ever-present witnesses. Perhaps I've not forgotten my lost coast nor even my ancestral tongue. They dropped me here, and here I've lived. And because I work like a dog, here is where I was reborn. And I sought to rely on epic story of the Mandinga after epic story. I rebelled. His Grace purchased me in a public square. I embroidered His Grace's cloak, and I bore him a son. My son was given no name, and His Grace he died at the hands of an impeccable English lord. I trudged forward. This is the land where I was lashed and beaten upside down. I paddled along all its rivers. Under its sun I sowed, harvested, and ate none of the crops. I got a slave barracks for a house. I myself carried the stones to build it, but I sang in the natural beat of the nation's birds. I rose in rebellion. In this very land I touched the warm blood and rotten bones of many others like me, brought here or not as I was. Then I stopped thinking about the way to Guinea forever. To Guinea or Benin, was I thinking about Madagascar or Cape Verde? I worked even more. Then I laid the foundation for my best millinery chant and my hope. Here I built my world. I went to the mountains. My true independence happened at the Palenque, and I rode with Maquio's cavalry. Only 1 century later, alongside my descendants from atop a blue mountain, I came down from the Sierra to put an end to capitalists and usurers, and generals and the petit bourgeois. Now I am. Only now do we hold and create. Nothing is beyond our reach. Our land, ours the sea and sky, ours the magic and the amazing dreams. My equals, here I see you dance around the tree we planted for communism. Its generous wood is clearly resounding.